"Get lost, you dog. Who do you think you are?" Ray Calder spat onto the scorching asphalt, his boot pinning down the woman who was struggling beneath him. 3 men dragged her toward a blue truck in broad daylight, in the middle of a silent crowd, and a middle-aged father stood there, his shirt faded, his posture limping, with no one to protect him. Only his 7-year-old daughter tugged at his hand, her voice trembling. "Dad, please help her." But just a few seconds later, in one single moment, everything reversed. No screams, no slogan-shouting heroes. That man stepped forward, and in less than 1 minute, 3 men who believed themselves above the law were sprawled across the burning asphalt. What they did not know was that something fell amid the chaos, a recording pen, evidence strong enough to drag an entire system into the light. He was a nobody. He was a former SEAL, and the very next day, a Navy Admiral appeared at his doorstep. If you were Mark Hale, would you choose silence to protect your family? Or would you stand up when those who abuse power believe no one would dare stop them? Subscribe to the channel now and leave a comment. What would you do when the price of truth is your own child? The midday sun poured down onto the parking lot of the highway-side shopping center like a sheet of red-hot metal. Heat rebounded from the asphalt, making the air shimmer, warping everything into something distorted and uncomfortable. People walked faster, more irritable, and looked at one another less. Cars lined up searching for empty spaces, engine noise blending with advertising announcements from inside the building. In a place this crowded, people assumed it would be safe, but it was that very crowding that created a perfect shell, concealing the things no one wanted to see. Mark Hale pushed the shopping cart out through the automatic doors, his other hand gripping his daughter's hand tightly. He walked slowly, his gait slightly off, each step carrying the caution of a body long accustomed to enduring pain. Noah stayed close beside him, her small backpack lightly bumping against her father's hip with each step. In the flow of people, Mark looked like countless other faces, middle-aged, quiet, blended in. His presence drew no glances, demanded no attention. To the crowd, he was part of the background, present enough to exist, never enough to be protected. They had gone only a few meters when Noah slowed. She looked ahead, her eyes wider than usual. Her small hand tightened around Mark's, the grip trembling. "Dad, please help her." Her voice was thin and fractured, as if afraid the hot wind would carry it away. Mark stopped the cart. He followed Noah's gaze and saw the scene unfolding between tightly packed rows of cars. 3 men stood in a practiced formation, hemming in a woman. They dragged her toward a dark blue truck parked at an angle, its body blocking part of the view. She resisted, her hands clawing at the door of a nearby car, her shoes scraping across the asphalt. "Let go of me. I'm not going anywhere." The cry tore upward, then was crushed into fragments by wind and engine noise. The man standing closest to her leaned in toward her ear, his voice low and sharp, clear enough for her to hear, easy enough for others to ignore. "You've already been warned." His name was Ray Calder. The metal chain around his neck glinted in the sun, his eyes mixing confidence with contempt. The other 2 took positions on either side, their movements efficient, as if they had practiced long enough to make any resistance pointless. Around them, the flow of people hesitated, then continued. A few phones were raised, lenses pointed toward the chaos like a harmless recording exercise. Some people watched with confusion, some turned away. Some pulled their children closer, lips pressed tight. In those eyes, familiar justifications slid by smoothly, like rehearsed excuses. Someone else's problem. They must have authority. Getting involved would only cause trouble. These reasons did not need to be spoken. They operated on their own. Mark felt Noah's hand grow cold. She stood frozen, her chest rising and falling quickly. He looked out over the parking lot, scanning briefly. The distance between them and the truck was no more than a few dozen meters. Escape routes were blocked by rows of cars. Sunlight bent everything, as if reality itself were being softened by heat. He looked at Ray Calder again and recognized the unsettling calm of someone convinced that everything would pass without consequence. The woman tried to turn her head, searching for anyone's eyes. Her gaze met phone screens, then slid off faces that looked away. She screamed again, her voice breaking apart. One of the 3 tightened his grip, pulling her hard against the truck's side. Metal rang out in a short, sharp sound. Mark stood there, the shopping cart in front of him, Noah at his side. Inside him, exhaustion accumulated over many years, pressed down on his shoulders, familiar as a heavy coat. But something else was rising, alert and cold. He noticed his breathing slow, steady. Small details sharpened the placement of each man's feet, the angle of the truck, the crowd's reflexes. He also realized the most frightening thing was not the 3 men, but the silent agreement of everyone around them. Noah tugged at his hand again. She did not cry. She only looked, as if waiting for a signal. Mark set the cart firmly in place, his hand still holding his daughter's, the grip stronger now. He heard Ray Calder let out a soft laugh, a dry sound, as though the woman's struggle were merely a task to be completed. Hot wind swept through, carrying the smell of rubber and engine oil. The parking lot kept functioning. A car backed out, and a horn sounded twice in short bursts. No one stepped forward. The familiar reasons kept running smooth, logical, safe. Mark halted. In that moment, the weariness in his eyes withdrew, replaced by a cold focus. His gaze changed, sharp and clear, like that of someone stepping out of an old darkness, a place where choices had once been paid for at a very high cost. Mark left his previous position with slow, even steps, as if he were moving through a familiar space. The cargo van remained behind with Noah, standing still among the tall vehicles in the harsh sunlight. Mark did not turn his head. He knew the girl was watching him, and he also knew that every movement at this moment was being measured. The distance between him and the group of men ahead narrowed gradually, meter by meter. In tense silence, he stopped a few steps away from them. The distance was just enough that his voice did not need to be loud to be clearly heard, just enough that it could not yet be considered an intrusion. "Let her go," Mark said. His voice was calm, carrying neither a request nor a plea, like a sentence placed in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time. Ray Calder turned around. He looked Mark up and down, his gaze sweeping quickly in assessment. A middle-aged man, no uniform, no visible sign of authority. Ray spat onto the hot asphalt, the motion slow and deliberately drawn out. "Is it your business? Get lost," he said, his voice hoarse and rough, accustomed to speaking without being questioned. The woman was held more tightly. Ray did not look at her, but his hand tightened, as if to remind her that control still rested with him. He glanced toward Noah, where the girl stood beside the cargo van, then curled his lip into a smile. "Or do you want that girl to watch her dad get beaten?" The words were dropped lightly, like a harmless suggestion, but the implication was enough to freeze the air. Mark did not answer immediately. He looked straight at Ray, his gaze unflinching. The woman seized that moment, struggling a little harder. "Help me." "They're not." Before the sentence could be completed, Ray yanked her hair hard, jerking her head back. "Shut up," Ray said close to her ear, his voice lowered but venomous. "You've talked too much." He loosened his grip slightly, just enough for her to stagger, but not enough to escape. It was how he kept control of the rhythm, both suppressing the victim and sending a message to the man in front of him. Mark took another step forward. The shortened distance forced Ray to adjust his stance. "Let go, right now," Mark said. This time, his voice was lower, firmer, carrying the weight of a command spoken by someone accustomed to having commands obeyed. Ray snorted with laughter. The sound was short and dry, without the slightest hint of amusement. "Who do you think you are?" He tilted his head, his shoulders rotating slightly, displaying the posture of someone who believed he stood at the top. The other two men shifted, spreading out to either side, forming a loose arc. A familiar movement, enough to block access, enough to show that Mark was facing more than one person. The crowd behind them began to stir. A few people stepped back. A few stepped half a pace forward to see more clearly. Phones remained raised, lenses trembling slightly with the breathing of those holding them. No one spoke. The silence was not from a lack of emotion, but from too many reasons pressing in at once, crushing any impulse to act. Mark felt Ray's gaze on him, probing, irritated. Ray was used to people reacting in one of two ways, either backing down or flaring up. Mark's prolonged calm broke that pattern. It annoyed Ray, as if control were being challenged in the most unsettling way possible. "Go," Ray said, his voice carrying a warning edge. "You don't want to get involved in this." The words were wrapped in the tone of advice, but his eyes were cold. He believed that as long as he stayed hard enough, the person in front of him would retreat, just as so many had before. Mark did not step back. He stood still, clearly feeling the ground beneath his feet, the heat rising up. In his mind, details rearranged themselves, the position of each person, the distances, the reactions that might occur. He knew he was being watched from multiple directions by Ray, by the other two men, by the crowd behind him. He also knew that in their eyes, he was nameless, without authority, without any legitimate reason to be standing there. The woman breathed rapidly, her eyes darting between Mark and Ray. She understood that if Mark turned away, everything would end familiarly. She also understood that if he stayed, the situation could become worse. That inner struggle made her body tremble. Ray leaned slightly toward Mark and lowered his voice. "Here, what I say goes," he said. "The law is behind me." The statement was delivered as an obvious truth, needing no proof, because he had lived long enough in the gray zone to believe it. Mark looked straight into Ray's eyes. He clearly saw the belief that allowed this man to stand in broad daylight without fear. It was not raw strength, but familiarity with the fact that no one intervened. That belief was fed by the repeated silence of those around him, by the times he had escaped responsibility without paying a price. The two men on either side tightened the encirclement slightly. They did not touch Mark, but their presence was enough to constrict the space, enough to send the message that this was not an equal dialogue. One of them glanced toward the crowd, saw no sign of intervention, and felt reassured. Mark took a deep breath. The searing hot air filled his lungs, then was released slowly. He felt his hand tighten slightly, very lightly, like an internal signal. He said nothing more. His silence now was not hesitation, but a decision reaching completion. Ray sensed the change before any movement occurred. He frowned, the corner of his mouth twitching. He did not like this feeling, the feeling of words no longer being enough to maintain the upper hand. He opened his mouth, as if to say something more, but Mark had already stepped into the final distance. In that brief moment, the parking lot seemed to hold its breath. Engine noise, voices, all receded into the background. Mark took one more deep breath. His hand clenched tighter. The decision had been made. The silence stretched on for one more beat, long enough for the crowd to begin murmuring, yet no one took their eyes off the center of the parking lot. Ray Calder stood there with his two companions, waiting for the next reaction, like men accustomed to watching others choose between fear and retreat. In that moment, many believed Mark would do what they had so often seen in predictable stories: rush forward, shout, turn himself into the center of a noisy confrontation. But Mark did not do that. He turned around. The movement made Ray hesitate for a brief second. He frowned, as if unsure of what he had just seen. Mark walked toward Noah, turning his back on the three men behind him. That action, to Ray, carried an irritating provocation. To the crowd, it looked like a retreat. To Mark, it was the first thing that needed to be done. He placed his hand on Noah's shoulder, heavy and firm, pressing down slightly to keep the girl still. "Stand behind the car." His voice was low and steady, leaving no room for argument. Noah shook her head immediately, tears spilling over, her mouth trembling. "Dad," the call caught in her throat, growing smaller as Mark bent down to her eye level. "No matter what you hear, don't look." He spoke slowly, one word at a time, as if sealing shut each door in Noah's mind. His gaze held hers for one more second, long enough for Noah to understand that this was not reassurance. This was an order given by the person she trusted completely. Mark straightened up. He turned away, leaving Noah frozen behind a nearby parked car. She lifted her hand, as if to pull him back, but stopped halfway. Noah did not cry out loud. She just stood there, her shoulders trembling slightly, forcing herself to do what her father had said, even though every instinct inside her wanted to run after him. Mark walked forward slowly, every step deliberate. Behind him, Ray let out a short laugh tinged with mockery, hesitating. "Are you, Dad?" His voice carried, loud enough for several people nearby to hear. He thought he had grasped the situation, that his opponent had just revealed the clearest weakness of all. Mark did not respond. He let the words pass as if they did not exist. His eyes swept over the scene, quick and precise. Two main exits were blocked, one by a truck parked at an angle, the other by a line of slowly moving cars behind. The space between the vehicles was just wide enough for three men to stand in a pincer formation. The woman was held at the center, pressed close to the truck's body, where pulling her inside would take only one more motion. He registered each person's position. Ray stood closest, confident, distracted by his sense of control over the situation. The other two split to either side, one slightly forward, the other half a step back. The distance between them was close enough to support one another, far enough to be confident that no one would dare intervene. It was confidence born of habit, of times when they had never been stopped. Mark stopped. The position he chose forced Ray to look up slightly if he wanted to meet his eyes. The distance was just close enough to make any next movement irreversible. Mark's breathing was steady and deep, the familiar rhythm his body automatically adopted whenever he entered a situation requiring intense focus. The sun beat straight down, drawing sweat to the back of his neck, but he did not notice. Ray sensed that something was wrong. He was used to people reacting immediately or leaving immediately. Mark's prolonged calm irritated him. He tightened his grip on the woman, as if to remind everyone who held the power. She let out a faint moan, a short, broken sound, enough to make Noah flinch in the distance. Mark did not look that way. He kept his eyes on Ray. The blankness on his face was not a lack of emotion, but a necessary shell to keep his thoughts from being disrupted. In his mind, each possibility was laid out, each reaction anticipated. There was no room for impulse, because every mistake here would carry an irreversible consequence. Ray curled his lip and stepped forward half a step, as if trying to break the stillness. "Why come back here?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Or were you running away and then changed your mind?" He wanted to pull Mark into the familiar game, where words led to action. Mark remained silent. He adjusted the position of his feet, very slightly, placing his center of gravity at its most stable point. A small movement, but to him it marked readiness. Everything outside began to blur: engine noise, voices, the clatter of metal, not because he could not hear them, but because he no longer needed to. The crowd behind felt the change, even though no one could put it into words. A few people held their breath, others instinctively stepped back. Phones were still raised, but the hands holding them began to shake. The silence now was no longer the initial indifference, but tense anticipation, as if someone were about to press a button that could not be undone. Ray tilted his head, irritation etched into his eyes. He did not like being ignored. To him, power was not just controlling others, but forcing them to react the way he wanted. Mark's silence stripped that away. It made him feel as though he was gradually losing initiative, even though on the surface the situation was still in his favor. The woman breathed rapidly, closing her eyes for a brief moment, as if bracing herself for the worst. She felt the shift in the air, sensed that the decisive moment was approaching. She did not know what Mark would do, but she knew he had not walked away. Mark stepped forward. There was no shout, no warning, just a foot coming down on the hot asphalt, decisive, without hesitation. The final distance was erased. Ray opened his mouth, as if to say something more, but that moment had already passed. The decision no longer lay in words. If you have ever believed that good people must shout to be heard, go on believing it. Mark's foot came down very close to Ray, close enough for the smell of sweat and metal to mingle in the air between them. Ray managed to register the change, but his reflexes were slower than the moment Mark had chosen. The instant the distance was erased was also the moment all calculations ended, and action began. Mark closed in, his hand clamped onto Ray's wrist, twisting hard in the direction opposite the joint's natural axis. The force did not need to be displayed, only applied at the correct angle. The sound of bone striking bone rang out, dry, sharp, and brief. Ray burst into a scream, the sound shattering in his throat as the pain hit too fast. His initial confidence collapsed in an instant, replaced by pure panic. Mark did not stop. He stepped half a turn, dragging the bent arm with him, using his own body weight to slam Ray face down onto the asphalt. The heavy impact made the air seem to shudder. Ray gasped for breath, the heat from the pavement blasting back into his face, the pain spreading from his wrist all the way up to his shoulder. He tried to roll over, but the pressure from above rendered every effort meaningless. A startled cry rose from the crowd. Some people stepped back, others shouted on instinct. The parking lot's false calm was shattered, revealing the violence it had been concealing. The woman who had been restrained earlier collapsed, released too abruptly, her trembling hands bracing against the ground to keep her balance. The second man reacted on instinct. He reached into his jacket pocket, his movement hurried and clumsy. Mark had already seen it before the arm even began to move. He pivoted, driving in hard with his shoulder, the strike compact and direct. The opponent's center of gravity was pulled off its safe position. The shoulder check ended with a short shove, just enough to send the man's head straight into the ground. The sound was low and heavy, completely different from the crack of bone before, like a slab of meat being thrown onto a hard surface. The man groaned, trying to lift his head, but the dizziness sent everything spinning. Mark did not need to look back. He already knew the man was no longer a threat for the next few seconds. Every movement that followed was directed at the remaining one. The third man charged in, the sound of shoes pounding urgently against the pavement. "You're dead," he roared, the sentence cut short by his own recklessness. Mark spun around, his gaze focused, carrying no personal emotion. "Get down, right now." His voice rang out clearly amid the chaos, not loud, not sharp, but strong enough to cut through the surrounding noise. The man hesitated, just a very brief beat, enough for confidence to collide with reality. That moment was his final mistake. Mark stepped into close range, collapsing the man's balance with a precise knee lock. He lost his footing, his body crashing down before he could understand what was happening. Mark pressed him into the ground, using his full body weight to pin him, locking the joint in a position that made all resistance futile. Everything happened so fast that many people around did not manage to follow it completely. They saw only fragments: a turn, a scream, a body hitting the ground. Less than 1 minute passed, and 3 men lay scattered on the hot asphalt, gasping, completely incapable of continuing to cause harm. There were no wasted movements, no display meant for the crowd standing open-mouthed. Mark straightened up, his chest rose and fell in deep, steady breaths as his body adjusted after the rapid sequence of movements. He did not rush to turn back toward Noah. His eyes swept the scene once more, an unbreakable habit. Ray lay face down, his arm locked in a painful position, his breathing ragged. The second man lay on his side, one hand clutching his head, eyes squeezed shut. The third was pinned flat to the ground, every movement under control. The crowd was no longer standing still as before. Voices overlapped, hurried footsteps echoed, and some people panicked and ran into the distance. Phones were still held up, but the footage was shakier now, lacking the earlier curiosity. A few people began to realize that what they were witnessing was not a video to share, but a reality that could not be edited. The woman slowly stood up, her legs still trembling. She looked at Mark, her eyes a mix of astonishment and gratitude, but also fear that had not yet faded. She opened her mouth, as if wanting to say something, then stopped, unable to find the right words. Mark merely gave a very slight nod, a signal that she should move farther away. Behind him, Noah stood behind the car just as Mark had instructed. The child's hands were clamped tightly over her ears, but the heavy sound still slipped through, impossible to block out. She did not look, but her imagination painted its own terrifying images. Her heart pounded hard, each beat trying to escape her chest. Mark glanced in that direction for a very brief moment. His gaze softened, but did not linger. He knew that if everything was not yet over, he could not allow himself to be distracted. The sound of sirens began to rise from far away, scattered but drawing closer. Some people in the crowd whispered to one another. Someone had already called the police. Ray coughed hoarsely, trying to lift his head a little. The contempt in his eyes was gone. In its place was shock mixed with fury. He looked at Mark as if wanting to say something, but the pain kept his words from forming. For him, being taken down was not the worst part. Worse was that it happened in broad daylight, in front of too many people, shattering the belief that he could do anything without anyone daring to stop him. Mark stepped back, half a step, creating just enough distance to observe all 3 men at once. He planted his feet in a stable position, ready to react to any sudden movement. The sun still beat straight down, the asphalt still burned, but the sensation now felt distant. His focus had not diminished in the slightest. The sirens grew clearer, more urgent. Some people began pointing toward Mark, toward the men lying on the ground. Whispers spread quickly, mixed with fear and curiosity. The truth had just been exposed in a way no one expected, but it was there now, naked and impossible to deny. The 3 men still lay there, motionless, gasping on the hot asphalt. Mark stood at the center of the scene, his posture solid, his eyes alert. He knew clearly that what had just happened was only the surface. Beneath the concrete and the sunlight, other things were waiting to be revealed, and the look in his eyes made it clear that this was far from over. The sound of police sirens rose from the distance, scattered at first, then quickly growing more urgent, tearing through the thickened air left behind after the scuffle. The crowd seemed released from a prolonged, held breath. Murmurs erupted, overlapping and chaotic. A few people stepped back completely, while others edged forward by a single step, as if the arrival of law enforcement had just permitted them to stand closer to what had just happened. Mark remained still. He did not take his eyes off the 3 men lying on the asphalt until he was certain that none of them was still capable of suddenly springing up. Only when 2 police cars rolled in, their tires hissing lightly against the hot pavement, did he slowly let his shoulders relax. Just a fraction, enough to shift from readiness to waiting. For him, this had never been a sign of an ending. 2 officers stepped out first, their eyes quickly scanning the scene. One stopped by Ray Calder, who was now groaning, clutching a wrist bent at an unnatural angle. The other looked at Mark, then around at the crowd, trying to piece together scattered fragments into a temporarily acceptable narrative. A familiar order began to reassert itself, but it brought no sense of reassurance with it. Ray was the first to recover his voice. He groaned, struggling to prop himself up, clumsy but noticeable enough to draw attention. "We were on duty," he said, his voice hoarse, then pulled a plastic card encased in a cloudy sleeve from his jacket. He held it up, not toward Mark, but toward the nearest officer. Like a rehearsed reflex, he attacked us. The officer took the card and glanced at it quickly. His eyes did not brighten with understanding, but with recognition that this was something that would make everything more complicated than necessary. He handed the card back, then turned to Mark. "You used excessive force," he said, his tone more declarative than inquisitive. Mark looked at him, then at Ray, then back at the crowd. He did not respond immediately. Explanations formed clearly and coherently in his mind, but he did not voice them. He knew that, in this moment, his words carried little weight. His silence was not an admission, but the only choice left to him. The woman stood a few steps away, her arms wrapped around herself, as if trying to keep her body from trembling. She stared at the scene with a new kind of shock, different from her initial fear. Earlier, the threat had been tangible: 3 men, a truck, explicit violence. Now, the threat had become more ambiguous, spreading outward, seeping into the way people began to speak and interpret what had happened. Another officer moved in, collecting statements from those nearby. The accounts were fragmented, inconsistent, and interrupted by speculation and emotion. Some said they saw Mark strike first, others said they saw the woman being dragged away. No one was entirely lying, but no one held the whole truth either. The truth, as usual, began to bend under the weight of perspective. Mark was asked to provide his name. He stated it clearly and slowly. The officer entered the information into a handheld device. His fingers paused longer than usual on the screen. A crease formed between his brows. "Wait a moment," he said, then stepped aside to exchange a quiet word with a colleague. Mark stood there, feeling the looks around him begin to change. They were no longer the curious stares of a crowd, nor the wary glances toward someone who had just been in a fight. They became something mixed with suspicion and distance, as if he had been pushed to the other side of an invisible boundary. He did not explain, nor did he react. Noah remained behind the car, exactly as he had instructed, but Mark could feel the child's presence, like a tether anchoring him amid this silent shift. The officer returned, his expression tightening. "Your file has restricted access," he said, avoiding direct eye contact with Mark. "There are sections we can't view." He said nothing more, but the hesitation in his voice was enough to convey that this situation was no longer simple. Another device was brought out. The small screen displayed a few lines of information, then froze. The text appeared brief and cold. "Classified." No explanation followed. No next steps were offered. Just a door slammed shut in the face of legitimate curiosity. The atmosphere shifted once more. The officers exchanged glances, their voices lowered. Ray Calder lay there, breathing more evenly now, the corner of his mouth curving slightly upward. He did not need to say anything else. The presence of those words spoke for him. He understood the power of this gray zone, where everything could be stalled, where responsibility dissolved into layers of procedure. Mark recognized the shift instantly. He was not surprised, but neither was he indifferent. A familiar sensation returned, the feeling of standing inside a legal void, where right and wrong were no longer determined by what had just occurred, but by things beyond reach. He did not argue, nor did he try to restate what everyone had just witnessed. He understood that, here, truth was not the only thing being weighed. The woman was guided farther away by an officer, and asked a few brief questions. She answered in a state of exhaustion, her voice trembling but controlled. She glanced at Mark several times, as if wanting to say something, then stopped herself. Words of thanks caught in her throat, not because she lacked gratitude, but because she sensed that expressing it now might make Mark's situation worse. In the end, no one was handcuffed. No one was declared a hero. The scene was gradually cleared, the crowd dispersing, carrying with them incomplete fragments of the story. The officers exchanged a few brief words and left, returning the parking lot to its original rhythm, as if nothing serious had just taken place. Mark remained a little longer, until he was certain that attention had moved away from him. He turned back toward Noah. The child ran to him, clinging tightly, her head buried against his chest, her breathing rapid. Mark placed a hand on her back and patted gently, a familiar motion, comforting and reassuring. The woman approached once more when the area had emptied. She looked at Mark, her eyes still unsteady. "They'll come back," she said quietly, more like a confession than a warning. "They always come back." She paused, as if weighing her words, then added, "My name is Elena." Mark looked at her and nodded slowly. He did not ask anything further, but something was already clear in his eyes. What had just happened was not an ending, but the beginning of a longer, more complex chain of consequences. The gray zone they had just stepped into had no clear boundaries, and once touched, it was very difficult to return to the way things had been. After the police car drove away, the parking lot gradually resumed its familiar rhythm of breathing, but that was only on the surface. Beneath the newly reassembled noise, the aftershock of the incident still lingered, hanging in the air like a thin veil of smoke. that had yet to dissipate. The witnesses dispersed into small groups, walking as they talked, each person carrying a different version of the story. No one stayed long enough to be certain that everything had truly ended. Elena leaned against a nearby parked car, both hands braced on the hood as if she needed a point of support to keep her balance. Her breathing was rapid and uneven, her chest rising and falling noticeably. The trembling had not yet left her body, even though the immediate threat had been pushed away. The feeling of safety did not arrive with the silence. It came later, more cautiously, and in Elena's case, it did not come at all. Mark stood nearby, keeping Noah close to his side. He watched Elena with a guarded gaze, not out of suspicion, but with the awareness that this woman was still within the circle of danger. When Elena looked up at him, her eyes no longer held the blind panic from earlier, but a different kind of fear, deeper, with a clearer name. "I'm not safe," she said, her voice low and urgent, as if afraid someone might hear. She gripped Mark's hand for a brief moment, the pressure just strong enough to convey urgency. "People like them don't give up." Mark nodded very slightly. He did not ask for more details, nor did he offer empty reassurances. He understood this kind of fear. It did not stem from what had just happened, but from what had occurred before, in the dark, long enough to become habitual. He placed a hand on Noah's shoulder, signaling the child to stay still, then turned his attention back to Elena. Elena released Mark's hand as quickly as if she had just realized she had done something reckless. She raised her hand to her forehead, brushing her hair back, trying to breathe more deeply. In that hurried motion, a small object slipped from her hand. It did not make a loud sound, only a very faint noise as it touched the metal surface of the nearby truck floor, then rolled a short distance before stopping. No one noticed. The people around them were still talking. The sound of engines starting drowned out every insignificant noise. Elena did not realize what had just happened. She turned when a police officer approached, gesturing for her to follow him to answer a few questions. The tension made her nod immediately, her eyes sweeping past Mark once more, full of worry. Before she walked away, Noah was the only one who saw the small object. The child stood behind the car, exactly where Mark had instructed, her eyes still red but no longer crying. When Elena turned away, Noah bent down instinctively, as if something had drawn her attention. Under the flickering reflection of sunlight, she saw a small, slender object lying precariously near the tire. Noah did not know what it was, only that it was different from everything else around it, something that did not belong in this parking lot. She hesitated. In her mind echoed her father's instruction, "Stay still, don't look, don't do anything else." But the small object lay there, too close, as if waiting to be picked up. Noah glanced toward Mark. He was talking to someone else, his attention temporarily away from her. Noah bent down, her movement slow and discreet, and picked the object up. It was a voice recorder. Noah did not know its function, but she sensed that it was not a toy. She held it in her hand, noticing that it was slightly heavy for its size, its surface cool to the touch. A brief second passed as Noah considered. Then she slipped the recorder into the pocket of her thin jacket, clumsy, yet decisive, as if afraid that if she hesitated any longer, someone would see. Elena was led farther away, standing beside the police car, answering short, fragmented questions. She said what needed to be said, but her own warning still echoed in her mind. She felt as though something was missing, an indistinct sensation, not concrete enough to name. She glanced around, trying to remember, but exhaustion and pressure caused her train of thought to break apart. Mark watched Elena being questioned, then turned to look at Noah. He noticed that the child was gripping her jacket pocket tightly, her small hand clenched, as if holding on to a secret. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low enough for Noah to hear without drawing attention. Noah shook her head. "I'm fine," she said, her voice quieter than usual. Mark did not ask further. He trusted her, or at least trusted that if something was wrong, he would notice soon enough. When all the procedures were finished, Elena was allowed to leave. She paused for a moment, looking at Mark and Noah, hesitation in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, finally managing to say the words, "for everything." Then she turned away and walked quickly, as if afraid that staying any longer would reveal something she was trying to hide. Late afternoon passed in heavy silence. Mark took Noah home. In the car, Noah sat quietly, saying little, her eyes fixed on the view outside the window. Mark did not force her to talk. He let the silence do its work until they reached home. When darkness began to seep into the familiar corners, night fell completely. In the small kitchen, yellow light spilled over the wooden table. Noah stood beside Mark, her hand buried deep in her jacket pocket. She hesitated for a moment, then took out the voice recorder and placed it on the table. "This," Noah said, her voice low. "I picked it up." Mark looked at the object. He recognized it immediately, without needing to pick it up. A familiar sensation ran down his spine. "Where did you find it?" he asked. "In the parking lot," Noah replied. "It fell from Elena's hand." Mark said nothing more. He picked up the recorder, weighing it in his hand, as if measuring the weight of what it contained. He looked at Noah, saw the worry in her eyes, but also a fragile determination. "You did the right thing," he said after a moment. He pressed the play button. In the stillness of the kitchen, Elena's voice filled the space, clearer than anything Mark had heard earlier that afternoon. Her voice trembled slightly, but the content was coherent and specific. Names, locations, orders spoken in the dark, things that never appeared in official paperwork. Each sentence was a fragment, and when pieced together, the picture that emerged was frighteningly sharp. Mark stood still, listening. Noah stood beside him, her heart pounding, not fully understanding everything that was being said, but sensing the importance of this moment. The truth Elena had tried to keep did not disappear. It simply changed hands, now resting with a child who had decided not to look away. The voice from the recorder continued, steady, indifferent to the surrounding night, and somewhere within that darkness, a new chain of events was quietly beginning. "Do you think a child cannot keep an adult's secret?" The next part will answer. Morning arrived more slowly than usual, not because the sun rose late, but because Mark woke with the sensation that time inside his house was moving out of rhythm. The night before had left a heavy residue, clinging to every corner, every breath. The recording pen lay in the kitchen drawer, where Mark had placed it after listening to everything Elena had left behind. He had not slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, the voices from the recording surfaced again, clear and cold, as if they were still trying to force their way into reality. Noah sat at the breakfast table, stirring her spoon in a bowl of cereal that had already gone cold. She was quieter than usual. Mark looked at her, then turned away, pretending to be busy with the coffee machine. He did not want to ask. He did not want to explain. There were moments when he knew words would only make things more tangled. An engine rumbled on the street outside the house, low and steady, unlike the civilian cars that usually passed by. Mark paused, listening. The sound was unhurried, but not out of place. It stopped precisely where it should, right in front of the gate. A few seconds later, a knock echoed at the door, dry and firm, carrying no hesitation or social courtesy. Mark walked to the door. He did not look through the peephole, but when he opened it, the sight before him made him freeze for a brief beat. An older man stood upright, his appearance neat, his gaze sharp and composed. Behind him, a military vehicle was parked along the curb, painted in a muted color, unshowy, yet unmistakable in what it conveyed about the man who had just stepped out of it. "Mark Hale," the man said, without needing to ask. "I'm James Callahan." Mark nodded almost imperceptibly. He recognized it immediately, not from rank or posture, but from the way the man completely occupied the space in front of his doorway. "You're here because of yesterday?" Mark asked. Callahan looked straight into Mark's eyes. "I'm here because of Elena Brooks." The answer came quickly, without detours. Mark frowned. He shifted his body slightly, instinctively blocking part of the view into the house. "She's not my responsibility," he said. "I met her once." Callahan did not argue right away. He stepped inside as Mark opened the door wider, his gaze sweeping briefly over the simple interior, before settling on Noah. Callahan gave a slight nod, a wordless greeting, then turned back to Mark. "But you're the one who broke their chain." The words were delivered calmly, but Mark felt their weight. He closed the door, sealing the house off from the outside world. "Who are you talking about?" Mark asked. Callahan set his hat down on the table, his movements unhurried. "The men who dragged Elena away yesterday. Ray Calder is just one name among them." He paused briefly, allowing Mark to register the familiarity of the name. Elena Brooks wasn't a random victim. She was a target. Mark leaned his back against the wall, arms crossed. "A target for what?" "For what she was collecting," Callahan replied. "Evidence of a network operating under the cover of special assignments. Missions that don't exist, on paper, but leave very real consequences behind." He looked at Mark without breaking eye contact. "The vulnerable are chosen as expendable pieces." The air in the room grew heavier. Noah looked up at Mark, then at Callahan, not fully understanding, but understanding enough to sense the gravity. Mark clenched his jaw. "And the police look the other way," he said, his voice lowering. Callahan nodded, "because they believe they're above the law." He did not need to explain further. Both men understood where that belief came from, and how it was reinforced by repeated escapes from accountability. Mark was silent for a moment. He thought of the recording pen in the drawer, of Elena's voice echoing through the night. "You know about the recording?" he asked. Callahan studied him longer, I know Elena had evidence, he said. I didn't know where it was. He tilted his head slightly, as if weighing his next words, until you appeared. Mark did not answer. He neither confirmed nor denied. His silence told Callahan he had reached the right place. You have no obligation to get involved, Callahan continued. But from the moment you intervened yesterday, everything changed. Mark turned to Noah. She lowered her head, gripping her spoon tightly. He turned back to Callahan. Why are you here? Mark asked. To warn me, to inform you, Callahan replied. And to assess. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Since yesterday, you've become a target. The statement carried no threat, only a fact laid bare. Mark felt the shift in the space around him, as if the familiar house had just lost its protective shell. He wasn't surprised. He simply saw the road ahead more clearly now, long, and without any easy way back. And Elena, Mark asked. She's under surveillance, Callahan said. By them, and by people like me. He paused, then added, she needs protection. But more importantly, the evidence needs to be brought into the light. Mark nodded slowly. What do you think I'll do? Callahan looked at him, and for the first time, his gaze softened slightly. I think you'll do what you did yesterday, he said. Stand there, when everyone else turns away. Outside, traffic noise began to thicken. Morning continued on, as if nothing remarkable were unfolding inside this house. Mark stood still, fully aware of the weight of every word that had just been spoken. The life he thought he was living had closed yesterday. What was opening ahead no longer required his consent. It had already begun. Callahan put his hat back on. I'll be back, he said, and next time, we won't have as much time as this. He stepped toward the door, then paused briefly. Be careful, Mark Hale. The door closed. Mark remained there for a moment, then turned to Noah. She looked at him, her eyes filled with both fear and trust. Mark placed a hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently. He said nothing, but in his mind, one thing was clearer than ever. From this moment on, every step they took would be watched. If you ever believed that good people must shout to be heard, keep going. Night fell over Mark's house in a way that was deeply familiar, silent, and without warning. Streetlights cast their glow through the windows, drawing long streaks of light across the floor, slicing the space into clearly defined patches of brightness and shadow. Outside, the neighborhood continued its normal rhythm of life, the sound of passing cars thinning out, a dog's bark echoing from somewhere far away. But inside this house, time seemed to slow, stretching into a heavy, oppressive emptiness. Noah stood at the doorway to the living room for a long moment before stepping inside. The girl did not run in, did not call out to her father, the way she usually did. She moved slowly, carefully, as if afraid of breaking something invisible hanging in the air. Mark sat in the chair, his back against the backrest, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the darkest corner of the room. He was accustomed to darkness, but the darkness inside his own home now carried a different feeling, closer, more intimate. Mark took out the pen. It was colder than he expected, light in weight, yet solid, enough for him to clearly feel its presence. His hand trembled slightly, not from immediate fear, but because his instincts told him this was a new boundary. He stood up and walked to the small table against the wall, where the desk lamp sat unlit. Mark turned on the lamp. A soft yellow light spread out, not enough to banish all the darkness, but enough to make everything sharper, more defined. Noah sat down in the chair across from him, her hands resting on her thighs, her back straight, as if waiting for something important. Mark pressed his thumb against the button. A faint click sounded, very soft, but in the stillness of the room, it was clear enough to make Noah flinch. After a brief pause, a voice came through. Elena's voice. It was not the panicked voice from the afternoon, nor the trembling voice she had used when standing in front of the police. The voice coming from the pen was calmer, lower, carrying the preparation of someone who knew exactly what she was saying. Ray Calder, her voice said, clear, each syllable carefully articulated. Warehouse number 3. Verbal order. Mark closed his eyes for a moment. The words arranged themselves in his mind, fitting together with what he had seen in the parking lot. With Ray's gaze, with the ambiguous card held up in front of the police, Elena's voice continued, unhurried, unhesitating. Other names were mentioned, specific locations, time markers spoken as facts that had been verified many times over. Noah sat still. She did not understand the full meaning of every sentence, but she sensed the seriousness. She looked at Mark, saw his jaw tighten, saw his breathing change. Each time, Elena's voice paused briefly. Noah held her breath as well, as if afraid that the silence would bring something bad with it. Mark opened his eyes. He stared into the empty space in front of him where the voice echoed, as if Elena were sitting there, laying out each fragment of truth she had held onto for too long. No written orders, her voice continued, only passed by word of mouth. If something happens, they deny it. The statements required no explanation, because their starkness alone was enough to expose how a system operated. Mark inhaled deeply, then exhaled slowly. The familiar sensation returned the feeling of facing a cold truth, one that left no room for personal emotion. But this time, unlike previous moments in his life, this truth was not on some distant battlefield. It was inside his home, right in front of his daughter. At that moment, a very soft knock sounded at the door, startling them both. Mark turned his head, his hand instinctively covering the pen, but the person at the door was Callahan, returning once again to confirm. He did not step inside, only stood there, close enough to hear every word, far enough not to intervene. "She's living evidence," Callahan said quietly when Elena's voice paused. He did not need to speak loudly. The words were not meant to persuade, but to confirm what Mark already understood. And this, he glanced at the pen in Mark's hand, is worth more than a human life. Mark did not argue. He knew Callahan was right. That small pen contained something many people would be willing to kill to bury. He looked at Noah. The look in the father's eyes now no longer held the hardness of the afternoon. It revealed a clear worry, deeper than any physical danger he had ever faced. He realized that from the moment Noah had picked up that pen, she had been pulled into a world he had tried to ensure she would never have to know. Elena's voice sounded again, mentioning calls that were never recorded, nighttime drives, people who vanished without leaving a trace. Each sentence cut into the shell of safety Mark had believed he could build around his family. He tightened his grip on the pen, then placed it on the table when the recording ended. The room fell silent. Noah swallowed, looking at Mark, then at Callahan. "Dad," she said softly, "will she be okay?" The question was simple, but there was no simple answer. Mark did not respond right away. He placed his hand on Noah's shoulder, squeezing gently, a familiar gesture, but this time filled with hesitation. "I'll do everything I can," he said after a moment, choosing each word carefully. Noah nodded, as if that was the only answer she needed. Callahan stepped one pace further into the room. "We have to assume they know Elena has lost this," he said, "and when they realize it, they will look for it." He did not continue, but his gaze lingered on Noah long enough for Mark to understand the rest. Mark stood up, walked to the window, and pulled the curtain back slightly. Outside, the streetlights were still on, the neighborhood still peaceful. The contrast sent a chill up his spine. He turned back, looking at the pen on the table, at Noah, at Callahan. A chain of decisions awaited, and none of them were easy. Mark's phone vibrated on the tabletop, shattering the silence. The sound was short and sharp, making Noah jump. Mark looked down at the screen. A new message. He opened it. There were no words, only a single dot. Mark stared at the screen, clearly sensing the meaning of that emptiness. It was not a glitch, nor a mistake. It was a reminder that they had been seen, that someone on the other side was waiting for a reaction. He looked up, his eyes meeting Callahan's. Without speaking, both of them understood that from this moment on, everything had entered a different phase. The third morning after the incident began with a very slight sense of wrongness, the kind of feeling Mark had learned to trust more than any vague intuition. The house was too quiet, not the pleasant quiet of a day off, but the absence of a familiar rhythm. Mark stood in the hallway and called his daughter's name for the first time, his voice echoing through the empty space and then fading away. Unanswered. "Noah," he called a second time, louder, moving quickly toward her bedroom. The door was ajar. Morning light slipped through the crack, casting an unusually long strip across the floor. Mark pushed the door open. The bedroom was empty. The bed was neatly made, the blanket undisturbed, as if Noah had left in a completely normal state. The window was slightly open, the curtains stirring gently in the breeze. There were no signs of a struggle, no strange sounds that might have drawn a neighbor's attention. Mark stood in the middle of the room, a cold sensation running down his spine. He turned, pulled out his phone, and dialed Noah's number. The ringing dragged on. No one answered. He called again, faster this time, his fingers trembling slightly. Still the same silence, stretching into discomfort. He scanned the room, searching for anything that did not belong, but everything was exactly where it had always been, too perfect to be reassuring. The phone vibrated in his hand. Mark looked down at the screen. A new message, not from Noah's number. He opened it. Only a single short line appeared. No exclamation points, no emojis, no further explanation. "Do not interfere in matters that are no longer yours." Mark's fingers clenched around the phone. The metal edge dug deep into his palm. He did not feel the pain immediately. Only when a drop of blood fell onto the floor did he realize how tightly he had been gripping it. The words on the screen carried no anger, no haste. They were calm, decisive, like an order that had been carefully considered. Mark leaned his back against the wall and took a deep breath, forcing his breathing not to fracture. This was not a kidnapping in the usual sense. No ransom, no demands, no deadline, just a single message, aimed straight at the deepest part of him. They did not need to negotiate. They only needed him to stay silent. The front door opened behind him. Mark turned instinctively, his hand still gripping the phone. James Callahan stepped inside, his expression unable to hide a rare tension. He looked at Mark, then at the blood on the floor. They crossed the line, Callahan said, his voice lowered, stripped of the composure he had maintained before. Mark lifted his gaze. There was no wavering left in his eyes. They touched my child, he said, each word spoken slowly and heavily, as if carved from something breaking inside him. Callahan did not argue. He understood the weight of that statement. When a system chose to reach into someone's family, every unspoken boundary had already been erased. He pulled out his phone and spoke quickly to someone on the other end, his voice low and urgent. Mark did not catch the details, nor did he try to. His attention was fixed on one thing alone, where Noah was. They will not kill her. A voice came from the kitchen doorway, cutting through the spiraling thoughts in Mark's head. He spun around. Elena stood there, thinner than the last time Mark had seen her. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, her face pale from lack of sleep. She stood upright, but her posture revealed the tension of someone who had been running for too long. Mark looked at her, a dozen questions rising at once. But before he could speak, Elena stepped further inside. They need you, she continued, her voice hoarse but firm. They need you to be afraid, and they need you to be silent. Mark did not ask why she was there. He did not ask how she had found his house. Those questions, important as they were, came after the fact that Noah was gone. What do you know? Mark asked quietly. Elena took a deep breath, as if preparing to say something that had weighed on her chest for the past 2 days. They do not take people for money, she said. They take them to teach a lesson, so that everyone else looks and understands what happens if they do not obey. Callahan stood still, his gaze moving between the two of them. He understood exactly what Elena meant. This was how underground systems maintained their order, through fear, applied with precision. Mark looked again at the message on his phone. The words were still there, cold and unchanged. He nodded very slightly, as if confirming something within himself. They think I will stop, he said. They think that will be enough. Elena looked at Mark, her eyes flashing with something that was both hope and fear. You will not stop, she said, more a statement than a question. Mark did not answer immediately. He walked to the window and looked outside. The neighborhood was still peaceful, the houses standing side by side as if nothing dark had ever happened. That calm now felt blinding. He turned back to Elena and Callahan. They want me to turn back, he said. Then I will go straight ahead. Callahan exhaled slowly. Straight into where he asked. Into the place they think I would never dare to go, Mark replied. His voice was not raised, not harsh, but it carried a certainty that seemed to make the room contract. And I will bring her back. Elena nodded. I know how, she said, but not through blind violence. If you charge in like last time, she will be in danger. Mark looked at her, his gaze sharpening. He understood that. This time was different. This time, every wrong step could cost Noah dearly. He took a deep breath, then nodded. Talk. Outside, a car rolled slowly past the house, its engine humming steadily before fading away. Callahan glanced after it out of reflex, then turned back, his voice low. We do not have much time, he said. Mark set the phone down on the table. The message still glowed on the screen. Like a challenge, he did not delete it. He wanted to remember every word, not to be afraid, but to know exactly what he was facing. Elena stepped closer, lowering her voice as she began to talk about routes, transfer points, places where people like Ray Calder believed no one would pay attention. Mark listened without interrupting. Each piece of information was a fragment, and somewhere in his mind, the picture of where Noah was being held was slowly taking shape. When Elena stopped, the room fell into a heavy silence. Mark looked at each of them in turn, then spoke slowly. They chose this way, he said. Then they will have to live with the consequences, somewhere, very far away. Noah might be sitting in a strange room, waiting. Mark did not know how frightened she was, but he knew one thing. From the moment that message appeared, every path of retreat had been cut off. The road leading toward the harbor was emptier than Mark had expected. Sodium lights stretched into pale yellow bands across the damp pavement, reflecting in shallow puddles left behind by the earlier rain. Elena sat in the passenger seat, one hand resting on her thigh, her eyes fixed on the phone screen displaying the empty time slots in the camera system. She spoke little, choosing each piece of information carefully, as if afraid that one unnecessary word might throw everything off course. Mark drove, both hands gripping the steering wheel, his eyes never leaving the road as it narrowed toward the towering cranes ahead. The final pieces clicked together in a cold, methodical way. A camera disabled at the right moment, shipping documents with matching signatures but a different stamp, a transfer warehouse changing shifts earlier than usual. Elena pointed to a marked spot on the map, her voice low. "Here," she said, "an old warehouse, right by the docks. Hardly anyone comes through at night." Mark nodded and slowed down. He did not ask why Ray Calder had chosen this place. He understood. Places people believed to be abandoned were often the safest places to hide what was not meant to be seen. The car stopped some distance from the warehouse. Mark cut the engine. They both sat still for a few seconds, listening to the wind rushing through steel structures, the sound of cables striking metal poles. Elena turned to Mark. "You shouldn't go in first," she said, her voice trying to stay calm. "That's exactly what they're waiting for." Mark opened the car door. "I know," he replied without turning back, "but I'm still going in first." Elena did not argue. She understood that some instincts could not be broken by reason. The warehouse door creaked as Mark pushed it open. The sound echoed through the wide, empty space, then bounced back in layers. The smell of old machine oil and sea salt mixed together, sharp and cold. Light from outside spilled in just enough to illuminate a narrow strip across the stained concrete floor. Mark stepped inside, letting the darkness slowly swallow the back of his jacket. Elena stayed behind, pressed against the edge of the doorway, her eyes sweeping the dark corners. "Noah," Mark called out. His voice burst forward, struck the walls, then dissolved, leaving behind a frightening emptiness. He called again, louder this time. "Noah." There was no answer, only the wind and the groaning of old metal. A hoarse laugh rose from deep inside, not hurried, not loud, just enough to confirm what Mark already knew. From the darkness, a figure separated and stepped forward, allowing the light to fall on a familiar face. Ray Calder. Dried blood still clung to the corner of his mouth, and the contempt in his eyes from before was gone, replaced by a carefully contained hatred. "Former soldier indeed," Ray said, his voice drawn out, as if savoring each word, always charging in first. He curled his lip and glanced briefly toward the door, where Elena stood. "I figured you'd come too." Mark took one more step forward, keeping just enough distance. "Let the girl go," he said, his voice low and hard. No extra words, no bargaining. Ray tilted his head, as if considering it. "Who do you think you are?" he asked. "You think you can walk in here, give orders, and everything will go your way?" He raised his hand and snapped his fingers once. From both sides, figures shifted, unhurried, silent. Mark recognized them before he could see them clearly. Their positions, their pacing, their spacing. These people were prepared. "Elena," Mark said without turning around. "Stay back." She did not answer. He knew she had heard him. Ray chuckled softly. "You still think you control the rhythm?" He stepped aside, revealing a corner of the room behind him, where a metal chair sat beneath a weak overhead light. Noah was there, her hands tied, her face blurred with tears. When she saw Mark, she broke down sobbing, the sound tearing through the space. "Dad." Mark froze for a very brief beat, long enough for Ray to strike. The blow came from the side, fast and heavy. Mark managed only a partial turn before the impact drove straight into his ribs. The air exploded out of his lungs. He collapsed onto the concrete floor, knees hitting first, then his shoulder. Pain spread outward, sharp and deep, twisting every surrounding sound out of shape for a moment. Ray stepped forward, his shoe stopping right in front of Mark's face. "You see now," he said quietly. "You came to the right place, the right way, exactly how I wanted." He gestured. Two others closed in, pinning Mark down, their grip firm and practiced. Elena took another step inside, but stopped when Ray turned his head toward her. "Don't," he said, without raising his voice. "You still have something to do." His gaze slid toward Noah, enough to make Elena freeze. Mark tensed, trying to push himself up, but the pain in his ribs stole his breath. He looked up at Ray. "This doesn't end the way you think," Mark said, his voice hoarse. Ray crouched down, close enough for Mark to see every tight wrinkle around his eyes. "Everything ends the way the one in control decides," he replied. "And today, that isn't you." Noah cried harder, struggling as the chair screeched beneath her. "Don't hurt my dad," she said, her voice breaking. Ray turned to her, looked for a moment, then smiled, a smile that never reached his eyes. "We're not going to go too far," he said, We just need him to understand. Mark forced his head toward Noah. I'm here, he said, even as his breathing came in broken pulls. Look at me. She tried to nod, tears streaming down her face. Ray straightened up and signaled his men to ease back slightly. You see, he said, you were warned. Some things are no longer yours to interfere with. He turned away and walked back toward the darkness, his voice echoing behind him. Keep him there. Mark lay on the floor, his ribs burning, his head spinning. He heard footsteps retreating, heard the wind at the door, heard his own ragged breathing. Overhead, the light flickered, its unsteady glow like a reminder that time was moving in an unfavorable direction. Noah's scream rang out, sharp and desperate, cutting through everything. Mark closed his eyes for a single beat, then opened them again, his gaze clinging to his daughter across the distance and the darkness. He understood that in this moment, he had stepped straight into the trap Ray Calder had set, and to get Noah out of here, what he had just done would not be enough. The cold concrete floor pressed against Mark's cheek as both of his arms were pinned tightly down. The grip was not hurried, but steady and firm, the kind of force used by people accustomed to working in confined spaces, accustomed to turning human beings into objects that needed to be controlled. Mark's breathing grew heavy and shallow. Each inhale dragged sharp pain through his ribs, where the earlier blow still burned. He tried to twist his wrist, but the reflex only sent deeper numbness through his shoulder. Ray Calder stepped forward. He paused long enough for Mark to feel his presence like a heavy shadow bearing down. Then Ray's boot came down on Mark's back, pressing slowly, increasing pressure bit by bit, like a lesson being retaught to someone who had forgotten his place. A hero, huh? Ray said, his voice low and drawn out. Around here, heroes are just the ones who get crushed first. Ray bent down, his breath hot against Mark's ear. This system grinds people like you into dust, he whispered. He did not need to raise his voice. The words were delivered with the certainty of someone who had seen the same ending play out far too many times. You really think a few punches in broad daylight change anything? Noah sobbed from the corner of the room. Her crying was sharp and broken, slamming into the metal walls and echoing back, as if the warehouse itself were protesting the scene. She struggled against her restraints. The ropes tightened around her small wrists, making the metal chair screech. Dad, Noah cried, her voice breaking with fear. Mark tensed, a fractured growl tearing from his throat. Don't touch her. The words were incomplete, shredded by pain, but their meaning was unmistakable. He tried to lift his head, to see Noah, to let her know he was still there. Sweat streamed down his forehead, soaking into the grime on the floor. Ray laughed. The sound rang out louder now, raw and unfiltered, stripped of any attempt to hide pleasure. Too late, he said. He straightened and gave the slightest nod. One of the men restraining Mark shifted his weight, increasing the pressure, like a reminder that resistance at this point was meaningless. Elena stood in the shadows near the warehouse door. The weak light from the overhead bulb did not reach her face, only enough to reveal tense shoulders and trembling hands. She watched the scene unfold, every detail carving itself into her memory. Mark pinned down, Noah bound, Ray standing at the center, confident and cold. Every familiar script of violence converged here, ready to conclude exactly as Ray intended. Elena's heart pounded. In her mind, the familiar paths appeared. Rush forward, create more chaos. By a few seconds, then everything collapses into permanent silence. Stay still. Watch it all be buried. Keep running with a guilt that never fades. She understood precisely where each choice would lead. She also understood that strength no longer resided in blows. Ray glanced toward Elena, the corner of his mouth lifting. You see now, he said, as if explaining a lesson. This is the price of talking too much. He turned back to Mark. You too. You should have turned around when you had the chance. Mark did not respond. He focused on his breathing, forcing his eyes to stay open, forcing Noah to see them. He did not need to win right now. He needed his daughter alive. That thought outweighed everything else, heavier even than the pain spreading through his body. Elena took a deep breath. Her hand slipped into her jacket pocket. The small data transmitter rested neatly in her palm, its surface cold and smooth. She had carried it for a long time, like a defensive habit, a last door she had never wanted to open. Her fingers trembled, but they did not stop. She turned her back to the center of the warehouse so Ray and his men would not notice the tiny movement. Noah cried louder as Ray took another step toward her. Stop, Mark growled, his throat dry and raw. The pressure on his back increased another notch, shattering the word. Ray raised a hand, signaling his men to pause, like a carefully staged display of control. Easy, he said. We're not in a hurry. Elena lowered her head, shielding the device in her palm. The small screen flickered faintly to life. She She selected the final secure channel, the one she had hesitated over for far too long. In her mind, her own recorded voice echoed back, cold and precise, a reminder that the truth had been prepared for this moment. She knew that once she sent it, there was no turning back. Ray turned toward her, suspicion darkening his gaze. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice dropping. He took a step toward her. "Don't be stupid." Elena did not turn around. She whispered, barely loud enough to hear herself. "I'm sorry." It was unclear whether she was speaking to Mark, to Noah, or to herself. Then she touched her finger to the screen. The data began to transmit. In that instant, there was no explosion, no blinding light, just a silent process, packets of information leaving the device, traveling along invisible routes Ray believed he controlled. Elena felt a pressure lift from her chest, replaced by a different fear, deeper but clearer. She knew she had done something irreversible. Ray sensed the change before any sound reached him. His eyes darkened. "What did you do?" he roared. He lunged toward Elena, but his step faltered when a distant siren pierced the air, faint and brief, like an incomplete signal. He hesitated for half a beat, just long enough for Elena to finish the transmission. Mark felt the shift. He did not know what was happening behind him, but instinct told him the balance had tilted. He forced his head up, looking toward Elena, catching her gaze for a brief moment. No words were needed. He understood. Elena whispered, her voice mingling with the wind slipping through the cracks in the doors. "Callahan," she said, each syllable compressed. "Send it. All of it." Ray spun back around, his face twisted with rage. "Too late," he said, but this time the words lacked their earlier certainty. He signaled, and the others tightened their hold around Mark and Noah, as if trying to lock reality in place before it could change. In the darkness of the warehouse, the data was already gone. Somewhere, a chain reaction had begun. Mark lay on the floor, the pain still present, his strength spent, but his eyes did not go dark. He looked at Noah, at Elena, and for the first time in this long night, he knew that his strength was no longer the only force that mattered. Ray Calder sensed the shift, even before the first sound rang out. He spun toward Elena, eyes wide, his shout breaking against the metal-filled space. "What are you doing?" The question burst out, not to receive an answer, but to cling to the last moment of control, slipping from his grasp. Elena stood still. For the first time since stepping into the warehouse, she looked directly at Ray, without avoidance, without hesitation. "End it," she said. Just one word, clean and final, sharp enough to sever every layer of justification Ray had ever relied on. From a distance, the sound of sirens rose, at first a single note, then quickly overlapping, urgent, spreading along the harbor like a wave. Ray stepped back half a pace, instinct warning him that this was not part of the familiar script. He glanced toward the door, where darkness had once been an ally. Now, the darkness was torn apart by sweeping, rotating lights. The warehouse door shuddered, then burst open. The crash of metal echoed against the walls, reverberating. Flashlights cut straight into Ray's face, harsh white light, giving him no chance to hide his expression. "Police, get down." The voice was clear, leaving no room for negotiation. Ray froze for a very brief beat. Then he turned, searching for a way out, his eyes darting between exits that were already sealed. The others faltered, their reflexes stopped short by the overwhelming presence. Handcuffs snapped shut around Ray's wrists with a dry metallic sound. For the first time, panic was plainly visible on his face, with no false confidence left to shield it. Mark lay on the concrete floor, pain still lodged deep in his side, but he had heard everything. He braced himself, pulling his body up, each movement heavy yet determined. Noah was still crying, her sobs gradually softening as she recognized the familiar sound of commands ringing around her. Mark crawled toward her, untied the restraints with hands shaking from exhaustion, then pulled Noah into his arms. She clung tightly to his neck, sobbing, her breathing uneven. Elena stood slightly to the side, silently watching the scene. A beam of flashlight swept across her face, revealing traces of fatigue that had not yet faded. An officer approached, asked a few quick questions, then nodded and gestured for someone else to take over. Elena did not offer lengthy explanations. She knew that from the moment the data was released, the story had moved beyond the realm of personal justifications. Ray was led away. He turned his head back, his gaze etched with fury, mixed with helplessness. The system he had trusted had betrayed him in the coldest way possible. Not a single word of protection, not a single door opening, only silence and handcuffs. Mark lifted Noah to her feet. He swayed for a brief moment, then regained his balance. An officer moved as if to help, but Mark gave a small nod of thanks, and continued holding his child. He felt Noah's heartbeat slowly steady, each small rhythm pressed against his chest. In that moment, everything else receded. Outside, the harbor blazed with flashing lights. Vehicles were lined up, barriers stretched into place, radios crackled continuously. Light crept into every dark corner of the warehouse, where silence had once concealed things no one wanted to see. Now, there was nowhere left to hide. Callahan appeared at the edge of the light, without fanfare. He looked at Mark, at Noah, then at Elena. His gaze carried no satisfaction of victory, only confirmation that what needed to happen had happened. He gave Elena a very slight nod, a gesture enough to say that the data had reached the right place. Mark turned to Elena. He did not offer a long thank you, just a look, heavy and real. Elena returned it with a nod. She understood that from this point on, her life would not return to its old trajectory, but at least, tonight had ended differently. Noah looked up, glancing around. The flashing lights reflected in eyes still wet. "Dad," she said softly. Mark bent down, pressing his forehead to hers. "You are not the price for adult silence," he whispered. The words were not meant only for Noah, but for everything that had happened, for all those who had ever been forced to remain silent. As they left the warehouse, the lights at the harbor continued to flash. Engines still ran. Procedures continued, but the darkness had lost its hiding place. It did not disappear entirely, but it had been dragged out from where it was accustomed to lurking, and that was something Ray Calder, and those like him, could not endure. Mark carried Noah across the boundary of light and stepped into the salt-laced night air. He did not win with fists. He won by staying when others turned away, by protecting the truth to the end, by believing that once light is turned on, it will find its own way. If you believe that truth always loses to power, this story was written for you. This story does not end in the warehouse, but in the choice each person makes to turn away for safety, or to stand and protect what is right. Mark Hale did not triumph through power, but by refusing silence, and by not allowing a child to become the price of adult fear. If this story makes you pause to think for even a few seconds, follow and subscribe to the channel to continue walking alongside stories of truth, justice, and those who dare to stand when the whole world turns away.